Hello, I'm Sasha Pickering.
And I'm Amélie Pickering.
And we're interviewing our grandparents.
They were all small children during the Second World War.
These are their stories. Enjoy the video. How old were you when the war started and how old were you when the war ended?
The war started when I was a tiny baby. I was probably a few weeks old. And it finished when I was 5.5.
Did you have toys to play with like cars or Barbies during the war?
No, I didn't have cars, I didn't have a Barbie, but I had a doll called Claudette. And I had some wooden cubes which you could make into a puzzle.
During the war, did you have healthy food?
I think we did have healthy food because my father used to grow things in a garden. And when we didn't have a garden, we had polenta, which is made out of water and maize flour, corn flour. Yes. And when I was a refugee, we had very little food. We had flour, potatoes, and corn and maize, which was made into a polenta, which now the very posh restaurants use. And then sometime, because we didn't have any meat, my father used to try to catch little birds. He made a little trap to catch little bird, and we shared a little bird between my grandmother, my mother, my father and myself. We shared a tiny little bird.
Did you have sweets and treats during the war?
No sweets. No sweets at all. And no cakes. My grandmother and my mother used to bake bread, and sometimes they used to make a little loaf out of a doll shape, and I used to eat this little doll made out of bread dough, which was cooked in a big communal oven.
Did your houses fall down and did you have to move?
My house didn't fall down, but we moved several times. We moved several times when I was a tiny baby and a toddler. I can't remember of that. But the last move I remember is when I was 4.5, and we moved. We left our house, and I even left my poupée, my doll Claudette, and we went off to Italy because the German made us leave the village.
Did you know who the first leader of your country was?
The first leader during the war, you mean? Well, during the Second World War, the leader was the Maréchal Pétain, and he had been a hero of the First World War, and a lot of people loved him and admired him. But then, after that, towards the end of the war, it was General de Gaulle who helped to free the country of France, and he came to England, and he helped with Winston Churchill.
What is the war and why do people die and why do they do it?
Well, war is, no one understands war really. War is when people are greedy, they fight with the neighbors. You know, it's like children fighting together against each other. But the problem with the war is people are greedy and they want another piece of the country.
But what do they do?
And they do.
Why do they do it?
Well, I have no idea. It's because it's human nature, and human nature sometimes is not very nice. And you ask me why people die. People die because there are people are fighting. Soldiers are fighting against each other. Soldiers are attacking civilians, children, old people, ladies, you know. And this is a problem because people, and there are guns bayonet, mitraillette, tanks, all those things, they kill people. They are killing machines.
What are civilians?
Civilians are the people who are not in the military, engaged in military action. So mums and dads who are not in the military action usually is older people or younger people. You know, a child, I was a child and I wasn't fighting. I was a civilian, yes.
Was your dad a soldier?
No, my father was not a soldier as such, but I know that when I was 1 hour old, he had to leave and he had to go to some barracks, quite a long way away, to join a regiment. But I know they didn't keep him because he was ill. He had a stomach ulcer. They decided they only wanted very healthy young men and he wasn't very healthy. So he had to come back, but he wasn't a soldier. And he was a resistant.
What is a resistant?
A resistant is a man or woman, a person, and some were older, some were younger, and they were very involved in fighting and against the enemy or for the friends of the enemies. And my father didn't go into hiding in the resistance, but he was helping by making false papers, false identity cards for people who were moving from hiding place to another hiding place. To be a resistant was very difficult and very, very dangerous because not only the Germans were looking for the resistance and the people who were very friends of the resistance, but they were also the French were looking for the resistance and to report them and to imprison them.
Did you go to school?
Yes, I went to school. I went to what you could call kindergarten, and I remember I was quite young. I remember my father fetching me from school because he was worried because there were bombings, and he wanted me with him and my mother while the bombings were going on. So that day he fetched me from school. But I didn't have a very good schooling because, in fact, I didn't come back to my village until 1946.
Did you have any friends during the war?
No, I don't think I had any friends because I was with my mommy, my daddy, and my grandma, and only grown-ups. They were only grown-ups because we were in a hiding place.
Did you have a bed to sleep on?
Yes, I did have a bed, but I didn't sleep in my bed very often. We used to sleep in a cellar. I used to sleep in the cellar with my mommy and my daddy, and we used to sleep on planks of wood. And on top of those planks of wood, there was like a huge pillow made out of crackling leaves of corn, sweet corn. And it was very noisy, and we slept there because there were bombings, and we felt more safe in the cellar.
What kind of clothes did you have during the war?
I had very plain clothes, and we only had one set of clothes for the week, and one set of clothes for the Sunday, which was a Sunday best. But at school, we had to wear, when we went to school, that is, we had to wear overalls to protect our clothes. And later on, when I was a refugee, it was very cold. We stayed in a mountain village, very high and very cold. And cousin of my mother, who was a seamstress, she made a coat for me, and a coat which was lovely, beautifully made, but in fact it was so uncomfortable because it was heavy. It was made out of an old army blanket, and it was heavy and very itchy, I remember. Yes. And my father, because he was worried about I had shoes that were falling apart, he found someone who made me some shoes, and my shoes were made out of leather, and under the sole there were hobnails, and it was very slippery because those nails were very slippery on the cobbles of the village.
Were you an evacuee or a refugee, and what is the difference?
I was an evacuee, I know that, but I cannot remember because I was a baby and a toddler, and because there were bombs and the Italians were on our back, and so were the Germans, so we had to move to Cannes or to Nice. We did several times, I think, and we stayed in the very posh hotels of Cannes and Nice, which were taken over for the population. I became a refugee the 29th of October 1945. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Germans knocked on the door and they called out, "Raus, raus!" They were like that. And we had to leave the cellar and leave all the village, people in the village, children, all people who were ill as well, had to move. And under the beating rain, it was really a terrible time. And we left on foot and we walked for 22 kilometers from Breil to town under the rain, and it was terrible. And I was only 4.5. When we left the village as refugees during the war, we were traveling on foot. Some people had carts, some people had pushchairs, and people were carrying bundles of their few possessions, because when there were no cars, no buses or anything, we had to walk 22 kilometers and carry all the things on our back. I didn't have much. I only had this little bag with a couple of books, and that was all, and nothing else, and maybe some underwear. I was carrying very little because I was only 4.5. But some people had to carry loads of things on their back, and big bundles and sheets and things like that, because a saucepan, because some people had to eat sometimes somewhere, and so they had to carry things, the few things they could carry, and it was difficult. So we stayed in town, because in fact my mother's grandfather had a house in town, and we stayed there, and it was quite a pleasant time, because I had a lot of family there, lots of great aunts and great cousins who were all grown up and were very nice to me, but the food was just polenta. That's all we had, and boiled potatoes. We didn't have anything else. And we stayed there until I think it was April, and then we had a problem because the Germans were looking for my father, so we moved from that village. We went overnight. We traveled in the tunnels, and we went to another little village. Well, it was not a village, it was a hamlet, and we stayed there until the end of the war.
Was your home attacked? If so, how was it attacked?
Well, my home was not attacked, but the village was attacked, because there were bombs and there were various people shooting. But I know when I came back to my home after the war, there were some holes in the walls, and there was some shrapnel in the furniture, and my mother was very upset because the beautiful furniture had been damaged.
What did the mums do when the war was on?
When the war was on, where I lived, the mums were just looking after the children and tried to protect them. And they were also queuing up for food because food was very scarce. So they had to go and early in the morning to queue up in the shops, see if there was any food to sell.
Were you scared during the war?
No, I wasn't scared because I was protected by my father, my mother, my grandparents. I was an only child and they were very good at looking after me. And I wasn't scared because, well, it just became a way of life. Okay? That's not a... I wasn't scared, but I think my cousins who were older, they were scared. I had a cousin who was 8 years older than me and she was scared. And my other cousin, 12 years older than me, and she's still alive. And we talk about the war and she was very scared.
Did your family stay together during the war?
Yes, my family stayed together. My father, my mother, and my grandmother. But my grandfather was not with us because he had he was made a prisoner by the French because my grandfather was Italian, and because he was Italian, the French soldiers came to arrest him. So he was separated from us. So we stayed together, in fact. Yeah.
Were you reunited with your grandfather at the end of the war?
Yes, we were reunited at the end of the war. We were reunited in Nice. And my grandfather came back with us to the village at the end of the war.
What could you buy in the shops?
Well, I think people were concentrating on buying food when there was food about. And it was very plain. There was some flour sometimes. Maybe sometimes there was bread. A little bit of sugar, not much. And everything was rationed. People you could only buy a certain amount of food. No sweeties. There was, I think, a little bit of butter, but there wasn't much. So people had to make do with what they had.
What was Christmas like during the war?
Well, Christmas, I can only remember two Christmases. One Christmas is when I was a refugee girl and we didn't have anything and it was Christmas. So my cousin, in that little village called Town, she made me some cubes, puzzle cubes. What are they called? Puzzle cubes? Puzzle cubes out of cardboard. And she made all those beautiful cubes. It was so neat. And I kept those cubes so well. And I was so careful with them. And I kept them for several years. And I was so jealous if anyone was touching them. It was a terrible thing. I was very, very, very selfish with them. And then later on, I remember just after the war, there was a Christmas. And my father, when we came back to our village, there was nothing. So my father and his best friends, they got together, and he was fortunate. One of the friends had a workshop where he was making furniture. So he made me a little bed for my doll. He made me a little table and chairs for my doll, and some little plates and little cups. Made out all of wood, and then he painted them. And we had a Christmas tree, and we always had a Christmas tree, except when we were refugees. But we had a Christmas tree because my mother had a lot of land, and she had a wood. And my father I remember the first Christmas we came back to the village, my father went to chop down a Christmas tree, and he brought it down, and we found some old ornaments, and we had this Christmas tree. And in fact, on the Christmas tree, we had some real candles, which was very dangerous.
How did your family celebrate birthdays during the war?
During the war, there were no birthdays. Birthdays were not celebrated because we had nothing. Everything was so difficult. There was no sugar, sugar was rationed, eggs were rationed. So because people didn't have much, maybe they made a little cake, but it was very seldom. No candles, nothing. Maybe they sang happy birthday and that was all.
Did you have family holidays during the war?
No, we didn't have family holidays. Holidays were not a thing we had. And we didn't have family holidays for a long, long time, because after the war we had to rebuild, repair our houses because there'd been some damage to the houses, and we had no money, and we had to grow a lot of food, and there was no spare money after the war, so we had no family holidays during the war.
What television programs were there for children during the war?
There was no television during the war, Sasha. No television at all. We had a radio, and that was very difficult. We had to be very careful how to use it, because sometimes my father used to listen to Radio London, and that was in fact forbidden, because Radio London was for the people who were against the Germans and against the Italians, so it was difficult. But we had no television, and I used to do drawings and cutting out when I had a piece of paper, and I was the same as every other child. All the children had to make their own amusement.
How old were you when the war started and ended?
Well, the war started before I was born, because it started in September 1939 and I was born in November 1939. So the war had been going for about 2 months, and I was 5 when the war ended.
Did you have toys to play with, like cars or Barbies?
Well, I certainly didn't have Barbies, because they weren't in existence then. And I wasn't, being a little boy, I wasn't really into dolls. I do remember that I was given a toy sailing boat one day, and it was a very, very precious and very expensive present, because I was always interested in boats and the sea. And I took it down to the beach with my brothers, and my older brother was supposed to be looking after me, so I must have been about 3, and I sailed it in a rock pool, and then we went back to have some picnic lunch, and I left the boat sailing. And when my mummy found out I'd left it, she'd paid a lot of money for it, she was very, very cross, and we had to go back to look for it, but the tide had come in, and I think it had sailed off to America or somewhere. No, my house didn't fall down, and it wasn't bombed. I was born in a house in Barnet in North London, but I only lived there for the first 6 months, and then we moved to Wealdstone in Harrow, because my father worked at the stationery office, which is about 15 miles away, but he couldn't, and he used to go there on a bicycle, but because there was a blackout and there was no lights, and he was doing a night shift, it was very difficult for him to get there and back on a bicycle in the dark, in the blackout. And the house in Wealdstone in Harrow and the house in Barnet are still standing, and there's people still living there.
What was the blackout?
Well, the blackout was when you weren't allowed any lights, because the German aeroplanes would come over and they would use the lights they could see from the air to navigate their way to their targets. So all the windows had to have curtains that let no light through. You weren't allowed to have any torches or lights. Cycles had no lights. Cars had very, very dim, small lights that only gave them a very little illumination to drive with. So it was very, very difficult to get around in the dark.
Did you have sweets and treats to eat?
No, sweets were very, very precious, because they were rationed. All sugar items were all rationed. And we used to get a ration allowance of coupons, but we never had any pocket money to buy them with. So we used to sell out half of our coupons to get some money to buy the other half. And I remember one day I was in hospital for some reason, I don't know why, and my mummy bought me a bar of chocolate, which was extremely precious and took a lot of coupons. And she gave it to the nurses to give me, and I never saw it. And when she asked me the next day if I'd enjoyed the chocolate, I said, "What chocolate?" And she was very, very cross.
What? You have to leave London during the bombings.
Well, yes, we did, but I don't remember much about it because I was only about 2 years or maybe 1.5 years old. We went to Anglesey in North Wales, and that was where we had the awful porridge and food there. I don't know where in Anglesey. I've never been back to Anglesey since, but I remember going to school there. That was my first school, and it was 3 miles from where we lived. And my very first day, and bear in mind I was only about 3.5, 4 years old, my very first day there, when it was lunchtime, I went into the dining room where they have the lunches, and I took one look and one smell, sniffed the air and said, "I'm not eating this," turned, walked out of the school gates and walked all the way home, about 3 miles. And I thumbed the lift. I put my thumb out and thumbed the lift, and a lorry picked me up and took me up to the top of this big hill. And when I got home, my mummy said, "What are you doing here?" and was horrified that I'd come all the way home on my own.
Was your driver a soldier?
No, he wasn't, because he was in what's called a reserved occupation. He worked in a government printing office, and so he was printing all the things like the ration books, identity cards, instructions, and all those sort of things that were very, very necessary. And so he was in a reserved occupation. But it did mean that he had to stay in Harrow in London, and with all the bombing. And when he was working either during the day, at night time he used to go onto the roof and used to do what they call fire watching, which was he used to stand on the roof and look for fires and then report them. And then the fire brigades would go and try and put them out.
Did your family stay together during the war?
No, we had to separate when my father was working in Harrow, as I explained, and we were evacuated to North Wales. So my mother and my 2 brothers and my older sister all went to North Wales.
Did you have a bed to sleep on during the war?
Yes, of course we had a bed. We didn't sleep on the floor, but we only had 1 bed, and I had 2 older brothers, and at the end of the war 1 younger brother, and we all slept in the same bed, and we used to sleep head to toe. So there was one person had the head at one end and the other person had the head down by the feet of the other, because it got a bit smelly sometimes. And there were, with 4 in the bed, sometimes the little one said roll over, and guess what happened?
What was Christmas like during the war?
Well, we didn't have very much food, but we always used to have a lot of fun. I do remember one year, Christmas pudding. We didn't have the Christmas puddings and things we have nowadays, but we had plums and custard. But the problem was that we had no bowls to put it in, and we had no spoons to eat it with. So the four or five of us used to just dip our fingers into the bowl and get some and eat it that way. All dipping into the bowl and runny custard together. And then we for drinking, when we had a cup of tea or something, we eventually, all the cups and plates and things were getting broken, and so to drink our drinks, a cup of tea, we only had jam jars, and we used to just drink out of our jam jars. But it's interesting because nowadays it's become very fashionable to use a jam jar as a drinking vessel.
Did Father Christmas exist during the war?
Well, I think he did, but he was a bit mean sometimes, because we didn't have stockings to hang out. We didn't have all these fancy stockings, but one year I felt a bit greedy and I hung a pillowcase out, and instead of getting filled with presents, it got filled with lumps of coal. But normally in the stocking or whatever, we got 1 orange, if we were lucky 1 little square of chocolate, and maybe a couple of nuts, and that would be about it.
How did you celebrate birthdays during the war?
Well, my birthdays were always a disappointment because my birthday was at the end of November, and I was always promised at the end of November, well, we didn't get you anything or very much for your birthday because it's going to be Christmas and we'll get you something for Christmas. And when Christmas came round, it was always, well, we didn't get you much for Christmas because you just had your birthday.
What methods of transport did you use during the war?
Well, mostly your feet. You walked everywhere. There were buses, but they were very infrequent and unreliable. So unless it was a long distance, you walked. My father had a bicycle, and he used to sit one child on the crossbar, one on the back rear carrier, and sometimes one on the handlebars. And he used to cycle along like that, if it was only a little way to go. But other than that, we walked.
How old were you when the war started, and how old were you when the war ended?
Well, I was 6 on the 3rd of August, and the war started very early in September. And then the war ended on the 8th of May in Europe, but in Japan it ended later. So I was either 5, I was either 11 or 12. 11 when it ended in Europe and 12 when it ended in Japan.
Did you have toys to play with, like cars or Barbies?
Well, I had some little car toys, they were dinky ones, but my favourite toy was Teddy. He was with me all the time. When I was a baby I had him, and I took him everywhere with me.
Did you have healthy food?
Yes, very healthy foods. There wasn't a lot of it, but it was healthy.
Did you have sweets and treats?
We had some sweets, but they were rationed. They were about 50 grams a week. And it was on the ration book.
What's a ration book?
Well, food was very short supply because a lot of it had to come from abroad, like America and those places. And to stop people being greedy and buying it all, we all allowed so much. And a ration book looked like this. And inside, it said where you got your milk from, and your meat, your eggs, and your cheese and everything, and the little pieces of paper which the shopkeeper took for every time. And you're allowed so much a week. I can't remember the exact amounts, but it wasn't a lot. The sort of food that you'd eat yourself in a day.
Was everything rationed, including water, during the war?
Not everything was rationed. Flour wasn't rationed, really, so we never went short of bread, because I thought that was a very basic diet. Got to make sure there was plenty of bread. But water was rationed, really, because you were only allowed 4 inches of water in your bath, and you had to paint a line to show where water was 4 inches deep. And you only could have a bath once a week. You couldn't wash your clothes every day. You had to make them last. You shouldn't get them dirty. You just had a bath once a week, but you had to wash, of course. But water was rationed in that way. And if you went to toilets, if it was a flush toilet, you couldn't flush it every time, you just did a little wee. And we didn't even have a flush toilet. We had to go down the garden because when one time we stayed in Evacuee, we were living in some little cottage, a row of cottages, and there was one toilet for all the cottages at the end of the garden, and it was just, it wasn't a proper toilet, it was just a hole in the ground and a seat over it, and you had to use it that. And what they called them was a tickle bottom, because we hadn't emptied the toilet properly, It tickled you. And it wasn't very nice, but you had to go in there in the dark even. There was no lights, just candles.
Did your house fall down and did you have to move?
The house didn't fall down, but some houses near us fell down. This is when I lived in Hull. It was very close. And later on, some houses fell down near us when we moved house. But during the war, I was evacuated. So I wasn't in Hull when the war was going badly.
Have treats to eat during the war?
No, there weren't any treats. Couldn't even have bananas. We never saw any bananas. There's no oranges. There's no fruit hardly at all. Only what we grew in the country, like apples and pears. But there's no fruit which came from abroad. And there was no crisps. Nothing like that.
What is the war and why do people die and why do they do it?
Well, the war started because somebody invaded another country. And they get greedy and want to take everything. And the rest of the world says, no, you can't. And so they declare war on them and saying, we've got to fight you to stop you. People do get killed fighting. And people do get killed without fighting because they get bombs dropped on them.
Was your dad a soldier?
My dad, your granddad, was a soldier in the First War. He tried to join up, but his eyesight wasn't good enough to go in the fighting, so he couldn't use a gun. So he went in the first aid. He went as a stretcher bearer in France, and there was a stretcher bearer all during the war in France in the war zone. He was in the Second War. He was a builder, so he's doing building repairs, bomb damage, urgent repairs in the hull. But he was also a night watchman and a first aider in the local Home Guard.
What's the Home Guard?
Well, the Home Guard was similar to Dad's army in a way. It was men that weren't fighting, which were old enough to do work, and so they were just watching for any aircraft, if in case of any invaders, and if any bomb damage, be there to help people and offer first aid for them. My uncle was an air raid warden. He used to listen to the aircraft and send people into the shelters.
Did anyone you knew die in the war?
No, nobody did. But my granddad and grandma had a bomb drop right in their garden. But they were in an air raid shelter, so they were safe. But the house was badly damaged.
Did you have a bed to sleep on during the war?
Yes, I did. But sometimes I had to share it with my cousin, because he came to stop with me sometimes.
Did you go to the school? Did you go to school during the war?
Yes, all the time during the war we went to school. Well, several different schools, but I went to the school every day.
What sort of clothes did you have during the war?
Well, we had clothes, but they were rationed and we had to make them last. So you couldn't just go and play in them, wear them all out. If they did, my mummy used to undo them all if they were knitted, because most of them were knitted then, undo them and re-knit them into something else, like a jumper knitted into a pair of socks or a pair of gloves. So you couldn't just go buy more because they were on ration.
Was your home attacked?
Well, it wasn't attacked directly, because when they dropped bombs, nobody knew where the bombs were going to fall. And they fell near the house, and later when we moved house, they fell near those as well. But we never heard the bombs dropping because we were asleep.
Were you evacuee or refugee, and what is the difference?
Well, I want a refugee. A refugee is somebody who's escaping from danger. An evacuee is somebody who's trying to get away from the danger that might happen. And yes, I was an evacuee right at the beginning of the war. So I went to live in the country because I out of Hull, so there was less danger of being bombed.
Were you scared during the war?
No, not really. I was too young to be scared because you don't realise the danger. And later on in the war, when Hull was being badly bombed, we used to stand in the bedroom window watching the bombs fall and the fires. Then later on, when they sent flying bombs over, we used to watch the flying bombs come across and coming. And when the flames went out on the bombs and dropped, we just used to duck down then, but we weren't scared. Children don't get scared like that. They get so used to it.
What did the mums do during the war?
Well, I don't know what most of them did, of course, because I think most of them just doing war work, like making machinery and anything working. But what my mum did, because I was 6 when the war started, and my brother was 9, and my sister was 2. So Mum came with me when evacuated, and she was looking after all the other children who were evacuated into that village. Now, when we went into the village, we went into different houses. We went, my mum, and myself and my sister, we stayed on a farm, and that was fun. That was ever so nice on the farm. And I used to go to help to fetch the cows in and help with the haymaking. But after a while, my mum had to go back into Hull to help out there because she was wanted in Hull. So I moved to another place, and I didn't like it so much. But I don't know really what she was doing in Hull, but she had to go back urgently. So I went into, and I stayed in a riding school, but I cried every time my mum and dad left. I didn't like it at all.
What could you buy in the shops?
Well, I was only still young, of course, so I never really bought much. But there wasn't a lot in the shops to buy, because you could only have essential things. You couldn't have little silly things like they have nowadays. And if you could buy, if there's any nuts or anything, you had to queue up to get them, and you only allowed a few nuts, and that was only at Christmas. But there wasn't much to buy at all in the shops. A lot of the shops were just empty.
What was Christmas like during the war?
Well, it's nothing like it is now. You couldn't have any lights on at all. There's no Christmas trees outside, no lights on them, and you couldn't even buy a Christmas tree. What my mummy did, she found an old hawthorn branch and wrapped it up in bits of sweet paper, bright sweet paper, and just put little bits of anything on them because you couldn't buy Christmas decorations. There weren't any. And you couldn't have Christmas lights on them. So I can't really remember what it was like in those. But we still had a happy Christmas. We were singing carols, we're playing games. But it wasn't as bright as it is now.
What did Father Christmas do during the war?
Well, I don't know what he was doing because he couldn't get toys either or presents. He was very short of things. And when you had pillowcases and big piles of presents now, we really just had a sock. Just a little sock. And I remember all was in was about 2 or 3 little nuts, hazelnuts, an apple and an orange, and a pair of shoes that had been knitted. And I think my mummy gave them to Father Christmas to put in his stocking. But at all, it was just a stocking with a few things in. That's all you could have. There weren't toys.
Your family stayed together during the war?
No, not at all. I and my sister Janet evacuated with my mother. Gerald, my older brother, was evacuated to another village a long way away because he went to a different school. My daddy stayed in Hull because he was working in Hull, but we didn't stay away for long because we found out the families were better off all living together even though it was in Hull. So we all came back, but we moved out of Hull into a place called Willoughby, which is about 3 miles out of Hull. So we were all together then.
How did you celebrate birthdays?
Well, it was much the same as Christmas, really. There wasn't again a lot of things. There was no presents hardly. My mummy used to make cakes, and she wanted a lot of flour. There wasn't a lot of butter. Well, in fact, there wasn't any butter. We had to use margarine, and she made these cakes. And we had a party with my cousin, and my auntie and uncle used to come. We used to have a party between us. But it wasn't just a family one, it wasn't everybody like you do nowadays. So we all enjoyed it, we played games again, and there was no television or anything in those days. We just, the family listened to the radio and that sort of thing.
What games did you play during the war?
I can't really remember much about that because we just played outside and chase and game and hoops. A bit of football. I can't really remember what the games were. There was nothing really special. It was just playing.
Did you have holidays during the war?
No, not at all. As far as I remember, we didn't have holidays. We might have had days out, but we couldn't go anywhere because there was no cars. We couldn't go anywhere. We just went for walks if we had a holiday. But I remember going to the seaside once for a week to stay with relations. But we didn't really have proper holidays like they do now.
What methods of transport did you use?
Well, the main method was bicycles. Because there weren't many cars about, and if you had the cars, you couldn't get any petrol. That was also rationed. There was buses, of course, you could go on buses, but the main thing was bikes or walking. You used to have to do a lot of walking in those days.